Okay.
21.
Yes, we're on page 21. Tonight we're going to be talking about situation ethics. And really in North America or in the English-speaking world, the primary impact of situation ethics was initiated by Dr. Joseph Fletcher, who was born in 1905. I recall meeting him because I was on a television program with him for about an hour. It was really 2 half hours back to back, debating situation ethics. And I recall at the time thinking that he looked like a kindly old man. And I was very impressed with the fact that he really looked very old to me. And then, having noted that he was born in 1905, and this took place about 1970, I now realize he was probably 7 years younger than I am now. Well, so much for dismal mathematics. He is pretty much the author of situation ethics, starting in the 1960s. Fletcher was an ordained Episcopalian priest who taught at Harvard Divinity School, and about the time that I met him, he was about to go to the University of Virginia as a specialist in ethics at their medical school. So, and now just kind of to fixate the time, notice that this is about 3 or 4 years before Roe v. Wade. And in the course of his lifetime, Dr. Fletcher evolved from being an Episcopalian priest ultimately to becoming an atheist, following in the hallowed footsteps of Mr. Hitchens, or perhaps Hitchens followed in his footsteps, as the case may be. Both are now in the same footsteps. But situation ethics got its real national kickstart in 1966 when Fletcher published the book by that name, Situation Ethics. And it was sometimes referred to as the new morality. Some of you may well remember the history of what took place then, but it was the foundation for much of what today has become biomedical ethics. And in essence, and I know this is right because I put it right to him, situation ethics is the denial of universal, binding, immutable norms of morality. And he affirmed to me that that is correct. So I have it from the horse's mouth. It was presented to people primarily as a response to what they call legalism. Legalism is the idea that you have certain fixed rules of morality never to be violated. And the objection to this that Fletcher and his associates raised is that this really was not a loving response to the human situation. It's impossible to completely separate this from theology because it was presented by Fletcher as a theological position of Christian ethics and reflecting the gospel of love, which, of course, the New Testament really is, and emphasizing the numerous citations within the New Testament wherein love is named as the predominant, if not exclusive, principle of Christian action and behavior. And thus, Fletcher read this as meaning that the only thing that really matters in any given situation is that you do the loving thing. Now this was, you have to put yourself back into the mindset of about 1970. This was the time when we were being told about all the back alley butchers doing abortions right and left and leaving women in terrible states of health or making them die, and that it seemed completely inconceivable that a loving God would put people into such horrendous positions. I believe at the time there was a movie and a book called The Cardinal, whose point was to just indicate the abysmal rigidity of the Catholic Church on the point of abortion, even to leading to some poor woman dying, when it just seemed to be an inconsolable situation. So that what we were to give and understand is that if morality is really to be a loving morality, it has to be somewhat flexible in relation to the legalisms that were being presented. This applied not only to abortion, but to divorce and to adultery and fornication and many things which were hard and fast rules, but which seemed in some situations just not to be properly applicable. That right reason and prudence would indicate that in this particular context, the rule was violative of what really was in the interest of the people involved. And so in this way of looking at things, Fletcher and other situationists insisted that we have to view morality as a kind of moving thing. I recall one of my associates at the University of Dayton giving a lecture at the time talking about the case of Sherry Finkbein, which was very famous at the time. She was I believe a Phoenix, Arizona news personality who was pregnant and who had taken thalidomide, which, as my colleague put it, meant that she was going to give birth to something that looked like a jelly bean with eyes. And that, of course, seemed, to be a very horrendous prospect. And he suggested that morality should be viewed rather as something like an amoeba. You know how an amoeba moves? It has its own structure and place, but it will put out a pseudopod. And if the situation is suitable, the entire amoeba will flow into that pseudopod, and that becomes a new position. So this is what Fletcher and others at the time were suggesting, that yes, we have cultural norms and values, we have rules, but we must realize that sometimes, in order to do what is truly the loving thing, we need to say no to the rule, that we have to have an exception to the rule, and that the ultimate principle of morality is love. And that this, as I said, was being presented as the new morality. And I recall on the television program where we were debating Fletcher, we just found it very difficult to pin him down as to exactly how you determined what is the loving thing in a given context. But the important thing was that one do the loving thing. Well, it wasn't until we got out of the program afterwards that he finally answered the question, how do you determine what is the loving thing to do? And the answer to the question is, well, you do whatever will produce the most good for the most people. Ah, this was the new morality? Well, not exactly. That which would produce the greatest good for the greatest number is the hallmark of utilitarian ethics. And utilitarian ethics goes back to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill back in the early part and mid part of the 19th century. Utilitarianism basically says that you do what works. You do what produces the right result. That you have rules that are, well, they distinguish between what they call hard rule utilitarianism, where you always do the thing that is best, and weak rule utilitarianism, which recognizes that even then sometimes you need a sub-rule. You see, because for this situation, the general rule would not be befitting, so you need a sub-rule to cover this exception. So, for example, murder is always wrong, but we have a sub-rule in the case of self-defense. And you see, this is one of the claims that was made against traditional moralists in the 1960s, that we would say murder is always wrong, but then we turn around and slip in self-defense or a just war as an example of an exception, it seems, to the rule. So how do you have a universal rule if you have an exception to it? Thievery, stealing is always wrong, except if you're starving to death and the other person doesn't really need the food. Then we have an exception to it. So they really accuse traditional moralists of being hypocrites for claiming that there are universal rules, but having exceptions to them. Now, I realize how one would normally respond to these, and I don't want to get sidetracked to that at this moment. But this was the line of argumentation, that traditional morality was a bunch of hypocrisy, and that people really didn't live up to it, and they made exceptions to the rule when they needed the exceptions. So utilitarianism, the new morality, was a way of codifying an understanding that these exceptions were legitimate. Now, I said Bentham and Mill initiated this. The new morality then goes back 150 years before Fletcher. And then we had William James with his pragmatism, sometimes known as the American philosophy, the how to do it morality. That which works is what you do. You do whatever works. If it works out well, that's fine. See, sometimes they focus on what we call consequentialism, or the consequences that flow from the act, or other times we talk about the motive of the person acting, which aims at an end. Then you get into the problem, well, do you really attain the end or not, and how do you know ahead of time whether you're going to attain it? So there are variant themes here within utilitarianism. You had Charles Saunders Peirce, who had what he called pragmaticism, same animal dressed up a little bit differently. John Dewey came up with what he called instrumentalism, still was the same thing. But you kind of have this notion, and then of course Joseph Fletcher. You kind of have this idea of morality as being like that amoeba or an iceberg that's kind of flowing along, and it has a certain structure to it, so they're not completely denying that there are rules, but you always have to be prepared to make exceptions to the rules, and if the exceptions become widespread enough, then that becomes the new rule. So Sherry Finkbein, who finally went to Sweden and got her abortion, represented that pseudopod into which the entire amoeba of the culture would flow. And that would then become the new morality that would permit things which Dr. Fletcher ultimately heartily endorsed, including euthanasia and abortion and sterilization for those that were not really fit to have children. I remember trying to nail him down by saying, well, would you have an abortion for an unborn child where the mother had been exposed to, was it German measles, and therefore the child could be born blind? I said, well, why wouldn't it make sense just let the kids be born and then kill them? He said, that's fine. Because that is what he was espousing. Now, mind you, here he is an Episcopalian priest. I actually can you think of a universal binding immutable norm of morality? Because he says there aren't any. Can you name one? Can you think of one?
A man was asked that question on a talk show by a feminist, and he said, "Thou shalt not rape."
Okay, that's a good one, but the even more famous ones are the Ten Commandments. There are a whole bunch of thou shalt nots, very boring, very legalistic, no exceptions presumed. And I managed to get him to explicitly, therefore, deny the Ten Commandments, which is rather interesting for an Episcopalian priest. Now, not in the abstract, concretely, he denied them. So it's not entirely surprising that eventually he wound up in atheism. So, needless to say, this doesn't leave much room for what we'd call natural law ethics, does it? But you have to kind of put yourself into the mentality of these people, because ethics does not arise in a vacuum. Ethics arises in the context of one's epistemology, one's metaphysics, one's cosmology, and the context in which this arises is inevitably connected to the notion of evolution, the notion of cultural evolution, the notion of normative evolution, the notion that things that may be fixed and accepted at one time in culture are not going to be fixed and accepted at another time. Now, when you say, but something might be just wrong, you can't ever do it. You see, what you're pointing to when you say that is some kind of a fixed nature. You're saying there's some act that by its very nature is immoral and never should be committed. And Fletcher and others, like Leslie Duarte at Toronto, would have said, but there are no fixed natures. Nature is in a constant state of evolution. Tie this to evolutionism, materialism, and the idea that everything is just flowing from one individual to another. Human nature, we talk about philosophy, we talk about natural law philosophy based upon the constancy of human nature. But from an evolutionary perspective, there is no human nature. There is a gradual sequence of individuals from lower sensory forms to what we might call higher and higher or more complex brain capabilities, such as we ultimately find in the kind of behavior that we find in men. We don't find the radical distinction then between sensory knowledge and intellective knowledge. This is a sensist epistemology and a materialist philosophy. And in this context, once you just step away from the notion that man has a fixed nature, it then makes no sense to talk about fixed categories of acts that are prescribed by their very nature. In fact, the problem is these people in their epistemology tend to be what we call sensists. That means you only know what your senses tell you. You are not able to intellectually grasp the internal nature of something. And to the senses, everything's in motion. Everything's changing. Everything's becoming. Everything's little shades of what it was before. And as such, you can't point to an absolute permanent structure or essence or nature in something by which to judge what is right or wrong. What you may call murder in one context would not be murder in another context. What is theft in one context is not theft in another context. So it depends on the situation. That's how they give rise to situationism. So there are correlatives here. In the metaphysical order, there are no absolute natures in things, which would then allow you in the epistemological order to know those natures. Since they don't exist and you can't know them, all that you have to go by is what the senses tell you, and this is primarily contained in the natural sciences. And of course, if you're trying to study human behavior, the default position goes to sociology and to psychology, wherein there are no rules. The only rules then become what do people do? And therefore you wind up with a kind of Gallup poll morality. You try to ask what is the morality of something like, you might see an exposition on sexual ethics, thinking, oh, I'm going to learn something about sexual ethics, and it turns out to be a sociological survey of what people do. Of course, needless to say, the Ten Commandments don't come out very well in that context. So, what we call intellect to these people is just a sense. It's just a highly developed form of sensation. It's a very complex brain activity. That's all that you're really dealing with. So it is not surprising that Dr. Fletcher may have started with a dualistic perspective as an Episcopalian, but wound up probably as a complete materialist, since he did wind up as an atheist. So there you have evolution in itself. So what does one say to this? And mind you, at the time, and I was in the context of a few years earlier at the University of Dayton, where we were having public expositions and lectures being given on situation ethics. And really what was being publicly poked fun at in this putatively Catholic university was the ethical positions of the Catholic Church and of natural law morality. This was viewed as being old-fashioned, out of date, not in sync with reality, not in sync with the more sophisticated understanding of the complexities of modern life. In other words, traditional morality was looked upon as simplistic, not sophisticated enough to grasp the difficulties that we find in life. And of course, some of the examples of cases that Fletcher brought up were good cases. I mean, you can find situations, indeed, where people would be very hard put to do what is moral, and you can find what we would normally call moral. Pardon?
The loving thing.
The loving thing, yeah. Because the loving thing many times would require seemingly betrayal of principles. Like some woman who got stuck behind the Iron Curtain, and the only way she could get back to West Germany and her family was if she was pregnant. So what could she do? Her husband was in Germany, she's in Russia. She got pregnant. And they dutifully categorized her as pregnant and therefore not useful, so they shipped her back to the West. And she was reunited with her happy family, who willingly celebrated the fact that she was pregnant because it allowed her to be returned to them. You see, when you start measuring things in terms of the consequence of the outcome, it becomes awfully tempting to say that you do what you have to do under the circumstances. Traditional morality, unfortunately, is not easy sometimes. And that's what really is at issue. The only thing new about the new morality of Fletcher is that it was emphasizing love, focused around love. But it was utilitarianism, it was pragmatism, it was instrumentalism, it was the same old stuff dressed up in new terminology, claiming that the essence of Christianity and the essence of what Christ taught was that we must always love. And how many times do we hear that? But, of course, there are a lot of texts that support that, but there also are texts that say other things, such as, if you love me, keep my commandments. Ah, what are those? Those are the very things, the 10 Commandments, that Fletcher denied. The problem with picking your texts out of the New Testament is you've got to pick them all, even the ones you don't like or that don't fit. But our concern is not the theology here. The problem, you see, with this ethics of love is, how do you figure out what's the loving thing? How do you know what the loving thing is? When you reduce it to utilitarianism, which is what it really is, you have to try to figure out what will be the results of what you do. And how do you calculate the results of what you do? When do you measure the results of what you do? There are certainly horrendous cases in history where people have done terrible things, and yet the outcome ultimately might have been very good. Or conversely, they may have done wonderful things and the outcome was ultimately terrible.
In essence, he was saying you can still do something that is evil or not good to get a good end.
Exactly. This is the essence of it. What traditional morality would say is immorality. A good end does not justify an evil means. But when pressed on that point, the way that Fletcher turned it is he would say, the end of course justifies the means. Because after all, it's only for the sake of the end that you seek the means. So you see, you got to go a little bit further and delineate, what do you mean? You mean you could get a good end, but are you allowed to do an evil means to get there? You see, the measure of the means for him would be the end. So the means is good if it gets you to a good end. And that's why it comes back to the epistemological metaphysical question, is there such a thing as an intrinsically evil means? Are there acts that are by their very nature so disordered that they never can be good? That's what's really at issue when you deal with situation ethics. And as we'll see pretty soon, we're talking about the three determinants of morality: the object, the end, and the circumstances. And we've talked about them before. What situationism deals with is the end, the purpose, the motive for which you're acting, and the circumstances in which you act. And those indeed are relevant to the morality of the act. But what is being ignored by situationism is the object of the act, what you are doing. Now, mind you, they know this, and that's why they deny there's a what. They deny that the acts have a nature unto themselves. Traditional moralists, of course, would point out that self-defense and just war are not exceptions to the rule, thou shalt not kill, but rather they are contexts in which the principle of double effect is being applied. And that's a principle, and you have to understand how it's applied. And you have to also understand that thou shalt not kill doesn't say that, as Dr. Waters has pointed out to you many times. The fifth commandment is not thou shalt not kill, but thou shalt not do murder. This is not found even in most of the common English translations. It has to be thou shalt not do murder because in the very next verses it lists a whole bunch of things for which the penalty is death. Stone them, kill them, for violating certain rules. Well, if there's an absolute rule that you can't kill anybody, how can the very next Bible verses say that you kill some people? The distinction is the first one says that you shall not murder, which means that you cannot deliberately take in an unauthorized way an innocent human life. Whereas those later texts refer to people deserving of what we call capital punishment because they are not innocent. See, the fifth commandment refers to innocent people. These other examples refer to people that have violated some law. And again, this is the case with reference to other supposed examples of exceptions. The catch is you have to understand the rule correctly. If you understand the rule correctly, then you will see that these are not exceptions. But that requires some thinking, which is not always easily done, and certainly doesn't appeal to the popular masses readily. You can see how long it takes to explain the foundations of natural law and how long it takes to understand something like the principle of double effect. So small wonder that when you're defending traditional morality against a situationist and he's justifying before a bunch of college kids the possibility that if you really love the person, it's okay to have sex with them, you guess who's going to win that argument? You haven't got a chance. As I recall, one of my students at the very same time coming to me outside of class saying, I understand all that you say about sexual morality, but I enjoy it too much. I'll try to argue with that. You can't do it. The difficulty, you see, here's the essence of the problem. When you talk about the object, end, and circumstances, circumstances can make, or the outcome, the consequence, the motive, can make something look beautiful on the outside because you've got only the most noble intentions. But I always think of it like having a beautiful cake, and it's got beautiful frosting, and it looks so delicious that you just want to dive into it and eat it. The only problem is the cake itself under the frosting is filled with worms. And you wouldn't find it so appetible if you understood what was really in it. And that's the difficulty. Can you put more frosting on the cake and turn a cake full of worms into something you really want to eat? Your problem is you don't have enough frosting on it. You need more frosting, see? It's going to be much better if you just get more frosting on it. And that's the problem with your circumstances and your motives and your ends and your outcomes. If you're talking about destroying an innocent human life, when is it okay to do it? when are the circumstances nice enough to justify it? Yes.
You were saying earlier about how who can judge what would be the better outcome and this sort of thing. I think of my sister-in-law's sister who was expecting a child, and the doctor, they'd done some tests, and they said the child was born without a brain or something like that. And I said, well, you know, you would have an abortion. And she said no, she wouldn't. And so anyway, she had the baby, and the baby turned out to be quite a bright little child. It was the apple of her eye. She's done very well in life.
Well, this is the problem. You need a crystal ball to make situation ethics work, because you don't really know what the outcome is. And that indeed is what drove Dr. Fletcher to come to the conclusion I mentioned to you earlier about children whose mothers had been exposed to German measles. Let them be born, because now we really will get the outcome right. 4 of them can see, we let them live. The 5th one, we just eliminate them, put them to death, because now we know they're blind. So you can see where the logic goes. You also have to understand that what is really missing here is any understanding of natural law referring to, ontologically, that we have natures, that nature can be known, that it has a structure, that the rational animal is a real being that is not simply a blend from earlier and lower forms of life, that to be a human being represents a qualitative jump in the evolutionary scale, if you want to talk in those terms, because we do have an intellect, we have a spiritual soul, and even if you had some other primate that was almost identical to us but lacked the intellective soul, it would simply be an animal. You see, that radical distinction between man and lower animals is absent in this way of looking at things. It may not have been initially for Fletcher, because remember, he's coming out of this Christian context. Now, did he know what he was doing? Did he know where he was going? I almost hesitate to mention it, but Senator Joe McCarthy called him the red minister or something.
The red dean?
Maybe the red cardinal. I forget what that isn't the term, but anyway, he alleged that he was a communist. And I do recall, and you might say, well, what was that based on? I was, just the ravings of Senator McCarthy. But I do recall somebody giving me a copy of the Congressional Record many years ago, I have no idea where I put it, in which the testimony of Herbert Philbrick was given. And many of you, most of you are not old enough to remember back in the 1950s, I Led 3 Lives. Herbert Philbrick was a double agent for the FBI working in a communist cell. At the same time, the third life was his normal American life. And he testified before Congress that Fletcher was a communist. So that's probably one of the sources for McCarthy's claim.
Judas cult.
So certainly if you wished to demoralize American society, nothing has been more effective than the spreading of situation ethics. And after all, when you talk to people and you talk about there being some absolute norms of any type, that's a pretty hard sell, because we are used to the idea that we have an inborn right to be happy and to have good outcomes to everything. And if morality gets in the way, well, again, what do you run into on television programs time after time after time? Difficult situations that people solve. And of course, solving it in the good old American pragmatic way, you do what works, and what works may or may not follow some rigid legalistic rule. So if you parody the rules of natural law as being blindly legalistic, they really come out on the short end of the stick when in the eyes of public opinion. And I assure you that we had a similar problem in the context of a university, a Catholic university with lots of young people. I mean, here you're trying to tell them that there are certain sexual norms that are absolute, certain things you just can't do by its very nature, and they're saying, but we're doing the loving thing. And sure they were. And of course, if they do enough loving things, you got a little problem with abortion, don't you? Because that comes at the other end of doing the loving thing.
Was Fletcher's contribution to this the fact that he wrapped it with this mantle of love? Because, I mean, so much of what you're saying is just, bad 19th century philosophy.
Yes,
It's,
it's the new morality.
Yeah.
But there's nothing new about it, except that, as you said, he wrapped it in the mantle of love. And how can you argue against love?
Perfect for the 60s.
Yeah, this was the 60s. And that's indeed when it was having its impact. So, what can one say? Universal binding immutable norms of morality. What are those? That's natural law. Natural law says you cannot murder, you cannot rape, you cannot steal, you cannot defame. Lots of things which you see, when you put it into a certain context, people say, well, was this really an incidence of rape? After all, she consented. Maybe it was an incidence of love. Or you defamed somebody, well, maybe the truth was that they needed it. Maybe there was good reason. You see, what happens in many cases, though, is you switch the facts around so as to justify the act by a rule which may indeed be applicable to that act, because you have misconstrued the initial rule that you were criticizing, such as when you say murder is always wrong, but we allow self-defense and capital punishment. Well, they misdefined murder. If you misdefine murder, then of course you have exceptions. The problem with the initial utilitarianism is this idea of having firm rules to which you had exceptions, which were sub-rules, is you'd get exceptions to the sub-rules, and then exceptions to the sub-sub-rules. So eventually you had no rules. And that's what you have in the case of situation ethics. I've mentioned to you before, the same colleague I mentioned earlier at Dayton, who published a paper entitled Situation Ethics, and in it he said, as a situation ethician, this means I have no moral principles. Well, I wouldn't hire him as a babysitter. I mean, think about it. I have no moral principles, but that's what he meant. That's what he understood, because a principle is a universal. A principle is something that always applies. So he really meant to say he had no such universals, no universal binding immutable norms. But what does it mean if you tell me you have no principles? Can I trust you with anything? Do I want you to be my banker, my accountant, my lawyer? If you have no principles, I have no way of knowing that you're going to get into a situation in which the best outcome would be to do me in. How do I know? We depend in dealing with people that they have, in the various professions, that they have codes of professional conduct. Where do you think these come from? And how much are they worth if they aren't really codified? How much are they worth if you can have an exception here or there? Now, sometimes professional codes do have exceptions, but the exceptions are delineated in the code. So you know what cases would be exceptional, what are not. Your attorney-client relationship, confidentiality, is absolute, excepting in cases A, B, C, and D. But those are universals. And you should be able to respect and trust and honor the structure of that code. Where do you think these codes come from? Ultimately, they're devised by ethicians. But the trouble today is you don't have so many ethicians around, you have a lot of ethicists. And the ethicists invariably are situationists. They're utilitarians. So all they're doing is looking at, what would seem to be the best thing, the best way to solve something, and they're giving you their opinion. trying to think of an example of one of the ethicians that they were asking about. Oh, yes. One of the difficulties we run into is when you start defining when you have a life that must be respected. Because since they don't really see a clear distinction between man and lower animals, they begin to get into the idea, well, anything that has senses has rights. And that it's more important not to define the utilitarian principle in terms of what will produce the most happiness, but rather what will eliminate the most suffering. Because after all, it's more important not to let people suffer than to just make them happy. And so somebody made the argument, well, by that logic, then what we should do is immediately blow up the whole world. There won't be any more suffering. And we'll do it instantaneously. Peter Singer, you've heard of Dr. Peter Singer, who has taught in, I think he's Australian, but he's taught at Princeton, who has advocated infanticide explicitly. But what you may not realize is that he doesn't eat oysters or mussels because he's not totally sure that they can't feel. You see what amazing logic you get yourself into? We'll put a child to death painlessly, but we won't bite into a mussel or an oyster. Above all, not a lobster, because sometimes you don't cook them thoroughly and they're still moving. You see, when you can't even define the line between what is human and what is not human. And you wind up according rights to the chimpanzees. Quite naturally. The Singer is very much into animal rights. Oh, by the way, I forgot one thing about Dr. Fletcher. The allegations that he was a communist, he did not only have a hand in founding the Planned Parenthood Foundation, but also he had a strong hand in forming the Soviet-American Friendship Alliance. So you can draw your own inferences. I think we had parallel German-American alliances being formed in the 1930s, and you know who attended those. I mean, it's okay today, but this was the 1930s. So how does one respond to situationism except by having a good course in ethics, a good course in natural law, a good course that establishes that there are indeed natures and that the human intellect is able to understand them, and that man is essentially different from other animals, not because we have the highest sensation, but because we have an intellective power, because we have free will, because we have a spiritual soul, something that no animal possesses. We are in a completely different category. And the wasteland that these people get into gets them into claims about animal rights, or possibly even vegetable rights, I suppose. Singer, of course, is the one who came up with the idea of speciesism. You know, we have racism, you're not supposed to discriminate against other races. Well, he has speciesism. You're not supposed to discriminate against other species, like those oysters. But all this tells us really is that you need to have good philosophy from the beginning. You need to have solid philosophy from the beginning. And that's why when you try to deal with ethics by itself, you're dealing with ethics in a vacuum. And in a vacuum, there is no ethics. And that's why ultimately situation ethics means you can do whatever you want to do, if you can think up a good reason for it, and if you can put it under the name of being the loving thing to do, or producing the greatest good for the greatest number. And you'll find there are all kinds of subdivisions of utilitarianism. You know, if you look back, go back to Bentham and Mill, there are all kinds of divisions as to, you know, is it purely hedonistic? Is it altruistic? Are you aiming for the greatest good for yourself or the greatest good for other people? Or is it the motives that you have? Or is it the consequences that are actually attained? Or is it just the consequences you aimed at? You see, all kinds of distinctions. But what they all have in common is a denial of the validity of the objective morality of the act. There is no such thing as murder for these people. There can't be, because if there really were, you never could make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. You couldn't turn murder into a loving act if it is intrinsically immoral. They are not stupid. So what they say is, nothing's intrinsically immoral. An act is good or bad depending on its outcome. And there is no way to know whether the thing in itself is good or bad by its very nature. So you can't classify acts as to being acts of theft or murder or lust or adultery, detraction, whatever you want. You can't classify acts, ultimately. You can only describe them, but again, you see, they fudge it up a little bit by saying, well, we do respect culture. It's not everything is ultimately relative to love, Fletcher would say, but we do respect culture. There are norms. And the norm for a while has been that you don't have abortions. But now the norm is that you have a right to abortion, and that women have an inalienable right to terminate a pregnancy, you see. So that's the new rule. I think they'd have to logically say, well, maybe we could evolve into something that would change that rule too. So they acknowledge that there are rules, but here's the problem. In any given situation, you can opt to ignore the rule in the name of doing the loving thing. Now, of course, here's the old principle. If you have an exception to a rule, what this shows us is you don't have a rule. That's one of those basic things that you have to learn in ethics. You know,
And
just
as a parent.
Pardon me?
And as a parent.
Yeah, if there is an exception to a rule, there is no rule. And that's basically what is entailed in situationism. So they may talk about rules, but the rule can be violated, which means you come back to the problem of, okay, do the loving thing. Well, what's the loving thing? How do we know what is the loving thing? The love is an act of the will. But man is not simply a will. The will is the intellective appetite. The appetite is specified by its formal object, which is presented to it by the intellect. In other words, we're not just wills running around loving blindly. You have to know what it is that you're going to love. And what specifies what you love is the intellect. So you can't just say, I'm going to be a real loving person. What are you going to love? How do you determine what you love? And there you have to have some kind of a rule, which even Fletcher admitted when he said, well, then you do the greatest good for the greatest number. He had a rule. It wasn't just pure love. It was love specified by its object. And the act of specifying it comes from the mind. It comes from the intellect. It tells us this is what I am doing, and I perceive it as being good, and that's why I love it. Remember? The good is being as desirable. And the mind judges what is good and what is not good. If you only go by love, how do you know what's the loving thing? How do you know who to love? And again, some of the examples they would give is, well, if you got to make a decision in an abortive situation between saving the life of the mother and saving the child, which one do you kill? And of course, the right answer to that is you don't kill either. You can't act to directly take either life. But by putting up this pseudo problem of which one you're going to kill, people immediately get into the problem, well, I don't know. And then they say, well, do the loving thing. Well, how do you know what's the loving thing? whose life has greater value? Then you start to get into the question of, well, this person is more important because of this and this, and this person's more important, but you have no principle.
I heard quite a few years ago, in the 80s, maybe before, that they were teaching in the grade schools, Catholic schools too, values clarification. And so this one child came running home, she's like, I don't want to go to school anymore because they put the kids in a situation where family would imagine that your family's on a boat and it's sinking. And
The lifeboat example.
And there's only room for
Yeah.
5, and you've got 6 in your family, and there's grandma, and she's the oldest, and who are you going to leave behind,
Yeah.
So the child had to make some decision there.
But you see, the decision that's posed already presupposes it's okay to kill someone.
Yeah. Somebody's expendable.
So this is a splendid technique to get the person to forfeit their morals, hand it over to whoever the team leader of the project is, and simply accept the principle that somebody's got to be extinguished, murdered, killed, and that it's only a question of who, not whether. The issue for morals is always whether. And that again is why Fletcher's influence and that of other situationists has gone through our society, through our educational system, with devastating results. It's very hard to get people today who will think in terms of principle. We are born pragmatists. That's why they say it's the American philosophy. We always just have to figure out what's the solution, whatever produces the best result. So utilitarianism was so popular that there was a group called the Benthamites in the British Parliament for large decades, as it was very popular. After all, there's always a solution. You never get into a situation, ethically, where you don't find a suitable solution because you have no principles to stop you from producing the end result that you want, that you desire. The difficulty with principles is sometimes you simply have to live according to them, even though they're very inconvenient.
The greatest good for the greatest number of people. Aren't there certain situations where that's a good thing, but the greatest good for the greatest?
Well, sure it is. Of course you want to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But the issue is, does the good end justify an evil means? Traditional morality would say you could save everybody on earth. I mean, the example I used to give to my students, I would say, look, if I came up to you and I took a baby and I put it right down in front of you like this. I won't pick you. You probably have a hard time. I put it right down in front of you and I say, look, here's a butcher knife. Kill it. And of course the student will say, I wouldn't do that. I'd say, well, all right, if you don't kill that child, I'm going to kill you. And they might still say, well, I'm still not going to do it. Well, if you don't kill that child, I'm not only going to kill you, but I'm going to kill your whole family. And of course, if they still resist that, I'll say, look, I'll not only kill your whole family, when I'm done, I'll kill the baby anyway. And you'd be amazed, you can run through a class like that, and you'll find some people who'll go all the way with you. But almost invariably, you'll find some point at which somebody will say, well, I don't know, I'm not sure, see? Now, of course, then the proper retort to me would be, well, what would you do in that situation? Well, my answer is very simple. Owing to the weakness and cravenness of my own lack of character, I'd probably kill the baby. But here's the point. If I do, it would be the wrong thing to do. And that is what's at issue. It isn't what people will do. It's a question of morality is what should they have done? If you ever grant there's a point at which there's enough at stake that it's okay to kill the baby, you have abandoned morality in favor of situationism, which is not morality at all. We do know under pressure, under circumstance, people do the wrong thing. But the difference, then people say, well, you don't have any morals. Yes, you do. You just violated them. That's all. You knew what is right and you did what was wrong. We do that all the time. It's called sin. The problem with the situationist is he wants to say not only can you do it, but it's the good thing to do. It's right. It's ethically justified, and that's what makes situationism intrinsically unintelligible and immoral. Everybody knows that people sometimes do the wrong thing under tempting, difficult circumstance. But what we want to know is what is the right thing to do. And this so-called structure of utilitarianism, situationism, consequentialism, whatever you want to call it, simply does away with any structure of morality. You can ultimately do whatever you want to do if you can find enough justification for it in your own mind. And that's not what morality is based on. The whole concept of morality is there are some acts that are such that they ought never be done. And you can't make them good. You can't make that cake good by putting more frosting on it. It just doesn't work. How do you know which acts are such? That's why you have to study natural law. But again, human beings who are not corrupted have a natural intelligence and sensitivity to morality such that they know you shouldn't be carving up little innocent babies. They know that's wrong. And if you ever put it in those terms, they're really hard put to justify it in their own conscience, in their own mind. But of course we are carving up little innocent babies by the millions, because thanks to the effect of the situationists in the last 40 or 50 years, who have managed to argue that the universal laws against abortion were too rigorous, too legalistic, not taking into account the unique circumstances, so that in these unique circumstances, we needed, in some rare cases, to allow it. You've got those so-called, rape, incest, life of the mother circumstances, the rare ones. But what do we have as the law of the land? You can have an abortion for any reason whatever at any time during 9 months of pregnancy. That's the law. Perfect example of how one exception to the rule utterly destroyed the rule. The rule is gone. And everybody knows there's something terribly wrong with what we've done, but they can't put their finger on how to fix it because they don't realize that having given up the rule, they gave up the whole ship. And that even allowing those 3 so-called rare exceptions leaves you logically always open to having the rest of them come back, because you have no rule, ultimately. All right, we will have to end ourselves tonight at this point if this is a situation where we stop. But we'll go back to expressing and developing natural law ethics in subsequent classes in the new year. I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, because we're not meeting till next year. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.